Well, now I will be talking today about how the lists were used and how they were used for the of establishing the dates of the early Greek history. So, this, which I will be talking about, is of course hypothetical to some extent, at least. My hypothesis, well, I will base my work, of course, on the predecessors of whom I have picked out here. Felix Jacobi and Alden Moshammer are perhaps the most important among them. And what I will present actually are some cases which hopefully will reveal the methods of the later ancient scholars when they tried to establish the dates in the early history. I will begin with more obvious examples, and then we'll proceed to some examples which are perhaps not that obvious. First, here is a selection of the lists, some of which will be debated by me today. We know that the Greeks composed or had different chronological lists. They might have been the lists of kings. Here I have, you can see the lists of the Spartan kings, 2 dynasties, and the list of the Lydian kings, which both will be discussed by me. But they also made annual lists. The list of Olympic winners was, of course, the most famous among them, the list of Athenian archons, etc. And which I will be discussing today is also the the list which possibly had existed, that was or might have been the list of the Carnean winners in Sparta, the winners in the annual contests of in the honor of Apollo Carneus. So what's important concerning these lists, that excluding the list of kings, which might have been given traditionally, and which certainly were given already by Herodotus, the annual lists quite certainly were constructions by the Greek scholars made not before the late 5th century. We know that the list of the Olympian winners was composed by Hippias of Elis at the end of the 5th century. The list of Athenian archons was composed, we don't know exactly by whom, but again, during the late 5th century. The Carnean winners, this list, if it did exist, was composed by Hellanicus, again, in the late 5th century. And what's also important to notice is that apparently these lists did not contain any historical information besides the very names which were listed. So this historical information, other than in the lists, must have been in a way found out by making by connecting some historical event to some person who was present in the list. And there was at the beginning neither any correlation between these lists. As far as we know, this correlation was worked out at the end of the 4th or the beginning of the 3rd century by Timaeus, who allegedly was the first to compare these lists and to take the list of the Olympic winners as the base, in a way, of the chronological reckoning. So now closer to my argument. Of course, for Sparta, it will be the subject of my talk today. The lists of the kings were crucial. These lists could have been connected to some historical event in the historical period. For example, not necessarily, but for example, the death of Leonidas in the Battle of Thermopylae, and then some length of reign could have been given to these kings, and in this way, the absolute dates of these kings could have been counted. Now, in this list, the first kings clearly were legendary. The later kings certainly were historical, where exactly the line between the legendary and the historical kings must be drawn. It's a mute point, but it's not very important for the discussion, because for the ancients, all these kings were historical persons and they were treated in such way. And for the chronological purpose, this part of this European dynasty was crucial. And it was crucial because of this Harilaus, the king Harilaus here, who, according to the tradition, was the king during whose reign the great legislator Lycurgus enacted the laws which made the Sparta the perfect state. Harilaus was known to have ruled, or was believed to have ruled, during 2 generations, because his father, Polydectes, died, according to the story, naturally, and therefore Harilaus actually, according to the story, ruled during 2 generations, and that of his own. And during his minority, that is, during this generation of Polydectes, he was tutored by his uncle Lycurgus, who thus, during this generation of Polydectes, enacted the laws. And the second important point was concerned this grandson of his, Theopompus, who was known, according to the tradition, as the conqueror of Messenia, which made laid foundation to the hegemony of Sparta. And these, now, how these 2 figures, these 2 events were dated. As I said, rulers could have been assigned durations of reigns, and in that way, the exact dates could have been calculated. So these are the dates which were calculated by Eratosthenes and Apollodorus. And in this list, Polydectes is omitted because he did not rule actually. Harilaus is accordingly given 60 years, that is 2 generations, everything in order. And the beginning of the rule of Harilaus was 885. It was very natural to assume that at that date, the beginning of the minority and the beginning of regency of Lycurgus, that was the date when Lycurgus enacted the laws. And so the laws were dated. So this became the very usual date for the Lycurgan legislation. Clearly dated according to the list of the Spartan kings. Now, on the other hand, there was a tradition that Lycurgus collaborated with Iphitus, the hero, by the establishment of the Olympic Games. So he could have been dated also according to the list of the Olympic winners. The list of the Olympic winners began with the year 776, and consequently Lycurgus was dated to that year. So there were 2 dates for Lycurgus. One date 204 years earlier than the other. That was the problem. How to resolve this problem? And there were solutions. Timaeus, who was the first to compare the lists, thought that consequently there must have been 2 Lycurgi. One at this date, other at that. The other scholars thought that, well, there was still 1 Lycurgus, but the Olympic Games must have been established. First at that time, early date, then they were either neglected during 108 years, or the winners were not recorded. And then was a second establishment from which date onwards the rulers were recorded. So the dilemma was resolved. But now, the Messenian Wars. There was a tradition that during the so-called Second Messenian War, which happened after the first conquest of Messenia, which was, according to the story, the Messenian revolt against the Spartans. Then was an internal crisis in Sparta caused by the war. And for resolving this internal crisis, from Athens, the poet Tyrtaios was called to Sparta. So Tyrtaios was a contemporary of the so-called Second Messenian War. And the verses of Tyrtaios said that, very famous verses, that Messenia was first conquered by the king Theopompus. The first war lasted for 20 years, and this war took place at the time of fathers of our fathers. That means 2 generations before Tyrtaios. What Tyrtaios did not say is who were the contemporary kings. Therefore, that was unknown. And now, when the scholars went on to define the date for the Messenian Wars, the only clue was Theopompus and the 2 generations, fathers of our fathers. So it was made, actually. We have a chronology of the Spartan historian Sosibios, who dated, we know, Theopompus from the year 770. Well, the following is conjecture, because there is reason to believe that he gave at least 47 years for Theopompus, and there is also reason to believe that the 47th year of Theopompus was considered to be the year when the conquest of Messenia was completed. And what we find actually is that exactly in that year, Pausanias, in his description of Hellas, dated the end of the conquest of Messenia. So there is very little doubt that these dates of the Messenian so-called First Messenian War were calculated according to the stemma of the Spartan kings, and more exactly according to the chronology of Sosibios. Yes, but the Second Messenian War, as I said, 2 generations must have been the difference. It was assumed that 2 generations were 80 years. And what we find again in Pausanias, Pantaleon, who was known from the tradition as a leader of the anti-Spartan coalition during the Second Messenian War, was dated 644. Exactly 80 years after that date. And Tyrtaios, who was known to have been called to Sparta slightly after the outbreak of the Second Messenian War, dated exactly 4 years afterwards. Logically. So again, quite clearly, the dates were calculated according to the stemma of the Spartan kings. No doubt, I think. But there were other points. Terpandros and Talentas, or also called Taras, who, again, according to the tradition, were called to Sparta to resolve some sort of internal troubles, and who were connected with the foundation of important festivals in Sparta, Terpandros with the festival of Carneia, and Talentas with the festival of Gymnopaedia. This Terpandros and Carneia will be important for my discussion. Now, the question was, how must these things to be dated? And what was the clue now? Were the internal troubles? These were given by the tradition, but the tradition apparently did not establish which kind of troubles they were. And therefore, there was two options. First, it was assumed, and we know that they must have been the contemporaries of Lycurgus, because Lycurgus was known, according to the tradition, to have resolved the previous serious internal troubles in Sparta. So it was assumed that these 2 poets also were invited to Sparta to resolve the pre-Lycurgan internal troubles, and consequently they were dated as Lycurgus, the year 776. Because that was one possible date for Lycurgus. And And this concerns Terpanos. But concerning Thales, in the Diogenes Laertius, who listed a number of Thaleses, he noticed also an early Thales, the earliest Thales in his list, whom he made the contemporary of Lycurgus, but unfortunately we cannot tell which exact date for Lycurgus he had in mind, whether it's earlier date for Lycurgus or the later date of Lycurgus. In any case, one date for Terpandros, 776, which was counted according to the list of the Olympic winners, is I think quite certain. But there was other possibility to understand these internal troubles, which caused the invitation of these poets to Sparta. Because, as I said, Tyrtaios was called to Sparta to resolve internal troubles. And it was also possible to think that these two poets, Terpandros and Talentos, were also called for the same instance. And therefore, it was possible to take them to the time of the Second Messenian War. And we see it was really done. We find Terpandros in the very same years as the Second Messenian War and Tyrtaios. And here is some slightly perhaps curious thing. We find in the Chronicle of Eusebius that Thales, and that time, the philosopher Thales, was also dated to the same year, which doesn't quite make sense because Thales was clearly known to have lived late. And therefore, there has been many speculations what this date is about, perhaps simply a mistake or so. I'm quite certain it is a mistake, but I think that he was simply mistaken by this Thaletas. This is in fact the Thaletas, Thales, the poet who by mistake has become the great philosopher in this chronological system. So we have already two dates, first 776 and then 640. But there is one more tradition concerning Terpandros. And that was, as I said, the tradition that he was the first winner in the festival of Carneia. This was first stated by Hellanicus, who composed the work Carneonicae, the Carnean winners. We do not know almost anything about this work. It exists now, and this Hellanicus also said that he was the first winner of Carneia, but also he was the contemporary of Midas, famous king of Phrygia. And the Laconian historian Eusebius said that Carneia was established at that day. And now the question is how this date was arrived at. And there is, in principle, two possibilities. Where possibly there was a list of the winners, according to which it must have been very easy to count this date. Or perhaps it was the date of Midas, which was assumed as the date of the beginning of the list. We don't know, to be honest. But we know something about Midas, which gives ground for some sort of speculation. Now, what we know, or what was known about this Midas, according to Herodotus, he was the earliest barbarian ruler who made dedications at Delphi, and he made this before Gyges. So he must have ruled before Gyges. I said Gyges, the great Lydian king. And the second thing which was established by the tradition was that he perished as in result of the attack of the Cimmerians, nomad people who divided Anatolia from northeast. And these both things could have been dated according to the list of the Lydian kings. Now, this list of Lydian kings, or the years, the regnal years of the kings were given by Herodotus, but they were in slightly different versions given also by in the Chronicle of Eusebius. What was certain for the ancients was the date of the end of the last king Croesus, 547. And now the different durations of reign were added to this basic date here, and there be different absolute dates were arrived at in these different versions. And now these chronologies would have been, of course, used also for dating Midas. What we find, Midas was dated in two different ways. First, in the Chronicle of Eusebius, we find that he was dated to his years. His death was placed in 696. And what we find in one version of these chronologies, Gyges was dated from the year 699. So apparently, it was calculated so that as Midas reigned before Gyges, his death must more or less coincide, or slightly his reign must be overlapped with the reign of Gyges. He was placed slightly before Gyges, and there the date was arrived. Well, this date does not concern us very much, but there is another date, for the end of Midas. This date was calculated or arrived at already long ago by Gelser. And this is what I cannot go in detail here. It is calculated, arrived at according to the list of the Judean kings, according to the Christian chronographers, who dated, who said that Midas perished during the reign of Amos, and the reign of Amos was dated to these years. It's wrong. We know it's wrong, but so it was dated. Now, what's important? This date was given for the end of Midas, and this is exactly the same date which was given for the establishment of Carneia. Thus, for Terpandros, who was, according to Hellanicus, the contemporary of Midas. And so we are back to the same question. How was actually this date arrived at? Again, there is the possibility that it was, after all, the list of the Carnelian winners. But I think this is not the right way. When we look, well, there was two things which was dated now, which was known about the attack of the Cimmerians, in the result of which Midas perished. And that was that it happened during the reign of Ardys, the son of Gyges. This is said by Herodotus. So the death of Midas must have been, according to this logic, not before Gyges, after Gyges, to the time of his son. And when taking the chronology of Herodotus, then we can see that Ardys began to reign at 679. Okay. And the date for the end of Midas falls suitably to the early years of Ardys, 676. Actually, we have substantial evidence that the early years of Ardys were truly used for dating the Cimmerian dimension by the later chronographers. So it seems that the date 676 was after all not arrived at according to a list of the Carnean witnesses, but according to the supposed date of the death of Midas, which was calculated according to the list of the Lydian kings, according to the regnal years given by Herodotus. And so the last thing, and I will end without a huge conclusion. What we find, Terpatros was thus dated to 776, assuming his synchronity with the Gulbas, which was calculated according to the list of winners. He was dated to 100 years later, 676, assuming his synchronity with Midas, whose death was calculated according to the system of the kings. And he was dated to 645 and so on, assuming his synchronity with Caius and the Second Messenian War, and the date of which was calculated from the list of the Spartan kings. 3 different lists and 3 different dates. When we now look at that, then of course I think we must conclude that at least the list of the Carnean witnesses did not play any part in this date. If this list existed or not is a moot point. We don't know what this Carnean ICAEM of Lanikos was actually. But even if there was a list, which is a possibility indeed, then this list was no documentary list actually, but it must have been a late composition, the start of which was calculated to coincide with the death of Midas. So thank you.